I am 93 years old, and there is one thing I did more than 60 years ago that I have never been able to forgive myself for. It was not an affair. It was not betrayal in the way people usually imagine. It was a lie. A lie so small at the time that I convinced myself it was harmless. But that lie destroyed the only marriage I ever had. The strange thing is that the lie was never meant to hurt anyone. I told it because I was afraid of what my parents would think, afraid of what people would say, afraid of being judged for the man I loved. For years I told myself that I lied to protect him, but that isn't the truth. The truth is harder to admit. I lied because I was ashamed of him. And the worst part is this: the man I was ashamed of was the best man I ever knew. I was 29 years old when I met Thomas. He was not the kind of man my family would have chosen for me. My parents believed in respectable lives, clean histories, careers that sounded impressive when mentioned at dinner parties. Thomas had none of that. Before I met him, his life had completely fallen apart. There were years when addiction controlled everything. He lost jobs, lost friends, lost the trust of almost everyone who once believed in him. At one point, he even spent time in jail. In my family, that kind of past followed a person forever. People believed mistakes defined you permanently. Once you fell, you stayed fallen. But by the time I met Thomas, something remarkable had already happened. He had rebuilt his life. He had been sober for years. He worked long days in a small mechanical shop. It wasn't glamorous work. Grease on his hands, oil stains on his shirts. But every morning he arrived before anyone else, and every night he stayed until the last job was finished. Thomas was a quiet man. He didn't talk much, but when he did, he spoke with a kind of honesty that made you listen. And there was something else about him that I had never seen before: gratitude. He treated ordinary days like gifts. At the time, I didn't fully understand why. Now I do. People who have nearly lost everything often learn how precious ordinary life really is. The person who introduced us was my best friend, Evelyn. Evelyn had known me since childhood. We grew up on the same street, walked to school together, spent entire summers lying in the grass, imagining the lives we thought we would have someday. Evelyn had always been the kind of person who quietly helped people. She never spoke about it. She simply did what needed to be done. Years before I met Thomas, Evelyn met him when his life was at its lowest point. Most people avoided him. Evelyn didn't. She helped him find work, She helped him find a recovery group. She believed he could rebuild his life when almost no one else believed that was possible. To Thomas, Evelyn wasn't just a friend. She was the person who helped him stand up again after life had knocked him down. 2 years later, she introduced him to me. At first, I laughed at the idea. "You expect me to date a man with that kind of history?" I said. Evelyn didn't laugh. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said something I didn't truly understand until decades later. People are more than the worst thing they've ever done. Thomas and I began seeing each other. At first it was casual. Coffee after work, walks through the park, long conversations about nothing in particular. But there was something about him that made pretending impossible. He never exaggerated his past, never tried to hide it. One evening, only a few weeks after we started dating, he told me everything. About the addiction, about the years he lost, about the time in jail. He didn't say it dramatically. He just told the truth. Then he looked at me carefully, as if waiting to see whether I would still be sitting there afterward. And I was, because somewhere along the way, I had fallen in love with him. But there was one truth I refused to admit to myself. I was ashamed of his past. Not ashamed of him exactly, just ashamed of what people might think. At the time, that difference felt important. Now I understand it wasn't, because shame doesn't stay small. It quietly shapes your decisions, and eventually, it begins directing your entire life. 2 years later, Thomas asked me to marry him. We were sitting in a small park by the river on a quiet Sunday afternoon. Children were playing nearby. Their laughter drifted through the trees. Thomas held a small box in his hands, but before he opened it, he said something that should have told me exactly who he was. "If we're going to build a life together," he said, "your parents deserve to know the truth about me." He wanted to tell them everything: the addiction, the jail, the mistakes. He believed honesty was the only foundation strong enough for a marriage. I told him I agreed, but inside, I was terrified, because I knew exactly how my parents would react. They would see his past. They would not see the man he had become. And if they rejected him, I wasn't sure I would be brave enough to choose him over them. So instead of telling the truth, I told a lie. I told Thomas I would explain everything to my parents, but I never did. Instead, I told them a different story. I described Thomas as responsible, hardworking, reliable. In other words, I introduced them to a version of Thomas that had never existed. At first, the lie seemed harmless. My parents liked him. Dinner conversations were pleasant. Everything appeared to be working exactly the way I had hoped. But lies rarely stay simple, because once you tell one lie, you must protect it, and protecting a lie requires more lies. Then one evening, Thomas asked a question that froze me in place. Did your parents understand everything about my past? I hesitated, and in that moment, I made the worst decision of my life. I told him they did, but I didn't stop there. A few days later, I wrote a letter pretending to be from my parents. In that letter, I thanked him for being honest. I wrote that they admired the strength it took to rebuild his life. I told him he was welcome in our family. When Thomas read that letter, he cried, not loudly, just quietly. Then he folded it carefully and placed it in his wallet. For years, he carried that letter everywhere. The wedding created another problem. Thomas wanted his friends from recovery to attend. The men who stood beside him during the hardest years of his life. People who knew the truth. If they came, my family would learn everything. So I lied again. I told Thomas my parents wanted a very small ceremony. I told his friends the guest list was limited. I even told Evelyn she wouldn't be part of the wedding party. She looked at me for a long moment when I said that. Are you sure that's what you want? She asked gently. I didn't answer. Looking back now, I think Evelyn understood what I was doing long before anyone else did. On the wedding day, everything looked perfect. White chairs, flowers along the aisle, my parents smiling, guests laughing. From the outside, it looked like the beginning of a beautiful life. But during the reception, I noticed Thomas looking around the room. His eyes kept searching for faces that weren't there, friends who should have been beside him, empty chairs, missing people. The next morning, he asked me one more question. Margaret, he said softly, are you absolutely sure your parents know everything about my past? I had one last chance to tell the truth, one moment to fix everything. Instead, I lied again. The truth came out the next day. I will never forget the moment Thomas realized what I had done. He didn't yell. He didn't raise his voice. He simply looked at me. And in that moment, I saw something I had never seen before. Not anger, not rage, just heartbreak. Then he said something I will carry with me for the rest of my life. That letter was the only thing that made me believe I belonged in your world. Thomas packed a small suitcase that afternoon. Before he left, he said quietly, I can forgive mistakes, but I don't know how to live inside a lie. Then he walked out the door. For years I believed he would come back, but he never did. Now I am 93 years old. Thomas passed away many years ago. Evelyn too. Most of the people whose opinions I feared so much are gone. And the strange thing about growing old is this: the things that once seemed so important become meaningless. But the consequences of your choices remain. If there is one thing I learned too late, it is this: fear is a terrible architect. If you build your life around what other people might think, you may destroy something that truly mattered. And sometimes, by the time you understand that, it is already gone.